After tough political decisions and a heavy lobbying campaign, the plenary of the European Parliament has finally adopted its position on the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. With this position, the European Parliament is going to enter into the so-called trilogue negotiations with the Council and the European Commission. The outcome of these negotiations will shape the final version of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence. This position is based on compromises made in the lead committee of the European Parliament, the Legal Affairs Committee, and under the leadership of Rapporteur Lara Wolters from the S&D Group. The Parliament's position is characterized by the following elements. First, scope. The scope is now aligned with the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which means that all companies based within the European Union are within the scope of this directive, provided that they have more than 250 employees. If a company is not established in the European Union, but a third country company, it is sufficient that this company generates 150 million euros net turnover worldwide, amongst which there is 40 million euro net turnover generated within the European Union. If these thresholds are not met by a third country company, it is sufficient that a parent company meets those thresholds, but then has at least 500 employees. This scope has a temporal phase-in, which means the following. 2 years after the publication of the directive in the official journal of the European Union, member states have to implement this directive. 1 year later, so 3 years after the publication, the directive and its implementing national law is applicable to companies having more than 1,000 employees. 4 years after the publication, this scope is extended to companies with 500 employees and to companies with 250, the standard scope. Yet those companies have the option to prolong this transition period by 1 more year, so that at latest 5 years after the publication of the directive in the official journal, it will be applicable to the scope as I have just outlined. The second element is the risk-based approach, which is a quite meaningful change vis-à-vis the original Commission proposal. This means that there are 3 categories now introduced with regard to the extent of due diligence obligations and the reach of the liability rule. The 3 categories are taken from the OECD guidelines, which means a distinction between causing adverse impacts on human rights and the environment, contributing to it, or being simply linked with it. If a company is causing or contributing to an adverse impact on human rights and the environment, it is fully subject to the liability rule. Furthermore, an expression of this risk-based approach is the fact that companies may prioritize risks within the value chain. This means that they only have to address the most severe risks, and severity is here defined in relation to the risks that there is an adverse impact on human rights and the environment, and not any further criteria. If there is a damage arising from a lower prioritized risk, and this prioritization was made accurately, that excludes the applicability of the liability rule. The value chain applies to both elements, upstream and downstream. It is now not mentioned explicitly anymore, upstream and downstream, but the activities of a company. The distribution and the sales by a company, which is the downstream activity, is also covered by the scope. There is a special role for financial services. The Council had decided in an overnight stunt to make the applicability of the directive to financial service providers optional. So it means member states can actually decide whether they make it applicable, which means in return that the directive is not applicable at all to any financial service provider. There's even an exemption for institutional investors. The Parliament's position has decided the opposite way. The Parliament has now decided that all financial service providers are within the scope and has even extended clearly the scope to institutional investors and asset managers. This is only consequent, because if we look at what makes real economy operators to actually comply with due diligence obligations, then in my understanding this is actually financial service providers. We are, let's face it, in a world in which supervisory authorities are understaffed, so their supervisory powers are not that scary. The liability rule, as carefully as it is drafted, has of course, as long as there is no burden of proof, the biggest disadvantage that it will be still very difficult for claimants to prove that the liability rule is actually met. Now, if now real economy operators have to be afraid that they do not get any financing for the operations if there is the risk of an adverse impact on human rights and the environment, that is going to make them being compliant with the obligations in the directive. It is therefore crucial that financial service operators are subject to the CSDDD obligations. Of course, the financial sector is a bit different than the real economy. And in that sense, the due diligence obligations, which means identifying risks, having a protocol and systems in place in order to mitigate risks and to stop those risks, that these due diligence obligations are slightly adapted to the nature of financial services. And that is due to the very fact that most likely finance is not directly triggering adverse impacts on human rights and the environment. But without finance, any impact that actually had materialized itself in a damage would most likely not have happened because there was no financing for these operations. Therefore, financial service providers are mostly simply linked with an adverse impact that could be materialized in the future. And that also looks at what is the temporal dimension of the due diligence obligation for the financial sector. The Commission proposal has said that those obligations are limited to the so-called pre-contractual phase. After a financial service contract is concluded, the job is over. This is what Parliament has changed. There is still a focus on the pre-contractual phase, but afterwards, whenever there is a moment of action for a financial service provider in the execution of the financial service, there is an ongoing obligation to once again check on the situation of the real economy provider. So, for example, if you have a loan contract and there are further installments, with each installment there has to be a new check how the situation is in the value chain of the real economy actor. As to consequences, the heaviest consequence that a financial service provider has is disinvestment. Change it or I withdraw my financial obligations. Here we limited the possibility for a financial service provider to actually not disinvest into situations of bankruptcy. So if there is an adverse impact or a risk for an adverse impact on human rights and the environment, and the withdrawal of any financial service would actually mean that the real economy provider is bankrupt, that's the only situation in which disinvestment for financial service providers is not possible. Let's return to the real economy operators. Next to their set of due diligence obligations and the possibility of a risk prioritization, we have in the Parliament's position the duty to establish transition plans, which is an obligation that we have seen already under the reporting obligations, but now there has to be a duty to set up an actual transition plan in order to combat climate change. When we look at the supervision and the control of due diligence obligations, we have supervisory authorities that must have a legal framework in the national law for applying pecuniary sanctions. In terms of public procurement, we have also now clarified that the compliance with due diligence obligation can be considered as a so-called environmental or social criteria when deciding on giving public contracts under public procurement. In that sense, there's another possibility to actually enforce the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. Let's have a look now at the core innovation of the directive, at least with regard to many member states. That is the civil liability rule. So next to the sanctions, the toughest tool in order to actually enforce obligations is the civil liability rule, and we know from previous experiences that liability claims in national legal orders were rarely successful. That is due to an issue of proof. What we have therefore now included as a Parliament is that whenever a claimant has substantiated a claim that there might be evidence that is within the control of a company that will actually finally has supporting proof for their claim, a judge may order a disclosure of this evidence to the court. It is not a reversal of the burden of proof as it was requested by the Parliament's own initiative report, and which was the position of the left-leaning groups within the European Parliament, but there was simply no majority for this position in the Legal Affairs Committee, since also the Liberal group that was actually necessary to have a majority refused to have a reversal of the burden of proof. So the best that we could get out there is a possibility for a judge to actually order the disclosure of evidence. In order to help victims, which are most of the time located outside of the European Union, to actually bring their claim in front of EU courts, we have now included the right that also mandated trade unions or civil society organizations can raise this claim in front of national courts. Next to the civil liability rule, there are the director's duties, which means that also directors have now a personal obligation to guarantee that due diligence obligations are within a company's policy and are actually met. As part of the voting in the plenary, however, the Article 26 on the possibility to oversee what directors are actually doing was unfortunately deleted due to a majority against it. Yet the most important element of it, namely that there are duties on directors, has also survived the final voting procedure. And that brings us that we have a Parliament position that is more progressive than the original Commission proposal, and certainly way more progressive than the position that the Council has taken. Now the negotiations in the trilogue are starting with the Council, with the major oppositions in the fields of financial services and directors' duties. Financial services are made optional and therefore outside of the scope in the Council, and the directors' duties are completely deleted. Also, the Council has not opted for a risk-based approach. So we're going to have interesting negotiations with the Council on this particular matter. But with the strong, rather progressive position of the European Parliament, I think we make sure that the final version of this due diligence directive is going to have a good shape. Let me conclude on one matter that was quite heavy in the discussions, the so-called single market clause. It was a question whether the due diligence directive should be maximum harmonization so that member states can actually not deviate from it. What we have now in the final compromise is an obligation on the European Commission, after 6 years of the entry into force of this directive, to check whether there is issues with regard to the level playing field in the European Union and then come up with new proposals in order to remedy this. The right side of the House wanted to have a maximum harmonization, which would be quite a bad outcome, given that we are legally speaking entering uncharted territories with due diligence law. It is therefore rightly so that for the coming 6 years we look how the implementation of the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive in national law actually looks like before we can draw proper conclusions how the next step, which might then even go into the direction of full harmonization, looks like. Now we are going to start the trilogue negotiations, and I will keep you posted on the further developments. Thanks a lot for watching this video.